is adopted.
On page 16, Mr. Speaker, the calendar conference report has been received for Delegate Cole's House Joint Resolution 615, HJR 615, conference report proposing amendment to Section 6 of Article 2 of the Constitution of Virginia and proposing amendments to the Constitution of Virginia by adding in Article 2 sections numbered 6A, 6B relating to the apportionment, state and local independent redistricting commissions criteria. The conference report has been distributed, is available online, and is before the body.
The delegate from Spotsylvania, Delegate Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. HJR 615 is the constitutional amendment that would set up a independent redistricting commission. The compromise would maintain a 16-member body. It would be made up of 8 legislators and 8 citizen members. The legislators would be 4 from the House, 4 from the Senate, 2 from each party on each of them. The 8 citizen members would be selected by a panel of judges. However, they would be selected from a list provided by the political leaders of the House and the Senate, so that there would be no chance of somebody trying to pack the commission with an inordinate number of partisans. The conference report does remove the governor and also from the process, and if we cannot agree on a redistricting plan, it would go to the Virginia Supreme Court to draw the plan. I move that we adopt the conference report.
The delegate from Roanoke City, Delegate Rasool.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking of the conference report.
The delegate has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, what we have before us is a resolution that says how we're going to be drawing our districts and moving forward. And it is certainly not perfect and not exactly what I was looking for in moving forward, but it does several important things that I think we need to keep in mind. Specifically on lines 27 and 28, it goes beyond the Voting Rights Act and says districts shall provide, where practicable, opportunities for racial and ethnic communities to elect candidates of their choice. It also does its best to end partisan gerrymandering, in the sense that of the 8 citizen legislators, the citizens who are on the commission, 6 of them must approve of the plan. So citizens will actually, for the first time, have a veto over any plan that comes before us. It also excludes former members of this body or former congressional members from being on the commission. And it requires full transparency so that people of the Commonwealth know exactly what is happening. There's a specific concern, and rightfully so, that of the 16, will communities of color be represented in those 16? And specifically, the 8 citizen members, we can come back in a criteria bill later on and designate that we need to ensure that of those 8 citizen members, and I'll be watching closely myself, also represent Virginia and represent communities of color to ensure that of the 16, we have a diverse perspective. So this is one of those cases. When I first got here many years ago, Mr. Speaker, one of the legislators said, we can't let perfect be the enemy of the good. And I think this is a good one for all of us in moving forward. And it's only fitting that today we have an opportunity to pass redistricting reform, because we know that in 2016, the late Senator John Miller passed away suddenly, and his wife Sharon Miller is here to watch us cast this vote. So I hope that we will support HJ 615, Mr. Speaker.
The delegate from Henrico, Delegate Bagby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking to the conference report.
Delegate has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hate to disagree with my good friend from Roanoke. But this is potentially 2021 will be the first opportunity for African Americans to really have a voice in redistricting. What this plan does with the 8 members on both sides does not allow for African Americans to be guaranteed a seat at the table. What we have right now in this caucus is a guarantee that African Americans will have a seat at the table. In 2021, if this plan goes through, again, we will not have a guaranteed seat at the table. It's evident by the number of conferences that we have. And up until, just to give you an example, up until a couple of sessions ago, we had no African American on the appropriations conferees. In this particular bill, it may not have been thought about, but there were no African Americans in conference on this particular conference resolution. So we have great concerns about having African American representation in the room for redistricting, and this doesn't guarantee that. Mr. Speaker, my grandfather always told me, and I would imagine individuals told you all, things you do with all your might, because things aren't ever done right. Mr. Speaker, this wasn't done with all the might of this chamber, so it wasn't done right. And while the clock has run out on us, I would say, and I hope that members will join me, that we need to put a red light up against this because it wasn't done right, and it does not provide for enfranchisement of African Americans across the Commonwealth. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Delegate from Fairfax, Delegate Samira. Delegate from Augusta, Delegate Landis.
Mr. Speaker, speaking to the conference committee report.
Delegate has the floor.
Mr. Speaker and members of the House, there are many of us that have not been big fans of independent commissions related to the constitutional responsibility of the General Assembly in the process of redistricting. And I've been one of those members. But I will tell you, Mr. Speaker and members of the House, I hope you will support this compromise because it is a true compromise. There has not been many times in this House where I've seen two divergent views on an issue, especially on this one, where this really has encapsulated parts of what the House version for the constitutional amendment had and what the Senate version had. That's very unique in this process. So I believe it's a true compromise, which is the first point I'd like to make. Secondarily, Mr. Speaker, it does address the concerns for some of us related to the legislative branch being involved in this process. Some of the original versions remove completely our involvement in that process. And it is our constitutional responsibility. But this also provides what I've heard from many of my constituents, and as Delegate Rasool mentioned, the citizens to have input in this process in a fair and equitable manner. Now, I understand the concerns that have been raised by Delegate Bagby and others, and I understand that concern, and I think there are ways for us to address that. In fact, if you look at the makeup of the members of the House and Senate, there is a way to make sure there's diversity encapsulated in those appointments. If you look at the appointment process, there's a way for the leadership of both the House and Senate, both parties, to ensure that there is diversity in that representation on that commission. So I think we can address those concerns, but I don't want us to lose the opportunity to actually get this done this session and in place before the next redistricting process, because if we don't, we are going to miss that opportunity. And for those of us that, again, have not been big fans, I think this true compromise is something, one, we can support, and I hope you will. And for those that have been really pushing for this issue over many, many years, and many citizens, I think this is fair to them, and more importantly, will be a great accomplishment for those who have looked for true redistricting reform. So, Mr. Speaker, I would ask the members of the House to consider your vote carefully and support this conference committee report.
Delegate from Norfolk, Delegate Lindsay.
Mr. Speaker, speaking to the measure.
The delegate has the floor.
While I appreciate the discussions that have been had on both sides of the aisle, I have to say that I disagree with some of the logic that has been advanced in favor of this bill. I've never felt like doing something at the last minute was the best way of just accepting something at the last minute was the best way to get something done or to honor one's responsibilities. My mother, who has been dearly departed for a number of years now, always had a word or a phrase that comes to mind and has come to mind several times as I've looked at this. That word is piss poor. This is a bad example of our representative responsibility. There are some that say that we're not abdicating our authority. I'd say that's exactly what we're doing. We started with a bad bill, a terrible bill. No offense to you, the patron, Delegate Cole, but I'm telling the truth. We started with a very bad bill, and we got modestly better. So for those of us who say, oh, well, this is an improvement over what we had, well, you're absolutely right. It is an improvement over what we had. But what we had was terrible, and this is just a little bit better. As you look at this situation, and I'll speak to the point of how so, thank you. When you look at the situation of who should be responsible, and when I ran in 2014, I always said that I had a problem with the idea that we picked our legislative districts and that the people should be at the forefront of that. I still maintain that. This does not get us to that point. As you look at this measure, the committees and what seems to be left out in the discussion is that assuming that these committees can't agree twice, then we abdicate our responsibilities and it goes to the Supreme Court. Well, I'll just tell you, Mr. Speaker, if we're taking the governor out of the process, I certainly don't want the Supreme Court in it because I've seen some of their rulings and they don't seem to be in keeping with what I would expect as representative of the whole of the Commonwealth. I say that with great pause. I'm not one to just jump up and throw firebombs, but this is just not in keeping with what we have as our responsibility. When you look at the configuration, and you're talking about committees, 4 from the House, 4 from the Senate, then you're talking about the members from the citizen composition. And I just say that if there's a concern about 100 people getting it right and whether or not the process can be gamed, that most assuredly can be the case when you're talking about 4 people and there's not clarity in the selection of those people. And while some would say, and I submit that these people are well-intended and they believe what they're saying, would say that we can improve this as we go, I hearken back to the words that my mother always imparted in me when it came to making the decisions. You do it right the first time, because otherwise it's piss poor. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Delegate from Suffolk, Delegate Jones.
Mr. Speaker, speaking to the resolution.
The delegate has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, I have listened intently to the debate on this item, and I was taken aback by a comment made about representation of minorities in the process. Back in 2011, when we were doing the last redistricting bill, I know that I personally met with each and every member of the Legislative Black Caucus that would meet with me, and I think it was everyone. And we came to an agreement with 80-some votes to pass that bill out of this body. Since then, we've been to court several times, up, and now back up. And we've heard a call for a redistricting commission from, I'm not saying the other side, but from across the Commonwealth, supposedly. And the other day we had a speech about fairness and all the above, of how people are treated, equal representation. So I spent some time trying to recall my first days in this chamber and what preceded me when I got here. I came in, I think it was 4753 initially, and we went to 49, 50, and 1, and we couldn't organize until that Thursday. So we ended up with power sharing, and we did co-chairman, etc. And I thought I would take a look at what the committee structure had been prior to that. Of course, now being on appropriations, I look at how fair we have been with proportional representation since we took control in 1999. And back in 1997, there was 21 members on the Appropriations Committee. 16 were from the other side of the aisle. 16. There never was a minority member of a party that chaired a subcommittee. The Republicans have had more African Americans on key committees than when the Democrats were in control. I asked the Speaker, put the right people on the conference committee. And I made a decision to make the gentleman from Prince William, dear friend of mine, chair a subcommittee which deprived one of my members on this side of the aisle of chairmanship. So it really hits me sometimes hollow when we say it's because of this we're not going to support something. I don't mean that with any disrespect, but I think the facts are the facts. And we, on this side of the aisle, have done proportional representational committees, key committees. Didn't have to do it when it was 51-49, but we did. The gentleman from Charlottesville and I had a conversation about, do you do this and that, depending on how the canister went. And I think we have acted in a fair manner during my tenure here. We have not always agreed, but I think we've tried to disagree without being disagreeable for the most part. Do I like the fact that we would have a commission do this work? No, I think it should reside with the body. But this is the best that I have seen during my tenure of an attempt to try to take as much of the politics out of it. I had a bill last year that dealt with compactness, contiguity, communities of interest, lines. That was vetoed by the governor. Could have passed it. When I was here back in the early 2000s, we would routinely come in the second, third, and fourth year to fix problems that were created. Had been done in the 80s, had been done in the 90s, had been done in the 2000s. But because there was a move to go and sue across the country, try to overturn districts, we could not make any adjustments to districts. And then that was used as a criticism of why the process was broken, which falls on hollow ears with me. Delegate from Portsmouth and I had a precinct that was not split. The local government decided to split it. We could not come back and fix that for the 57 or 67 people that were there. It's always going to be an inherently political process. This takes as much of the politics out of it as can be. But I just wanted to make sure that we all were on this same page of level setting where we are as a body and what we have done as the majority. Because I've heard a lot about the minority rights the last couple days if you're not in the majority. And I think we have comported ourselves with honor in that regard of trying to listen, be fair in the appointments, and then have a good, robust debate about the issues. Mr. Speaker, I would be in favor of House Bill H.J. 615 when we take the vote.
Delegate from Newport News, Delegate Price.
Speaking to the resolution, the conference report.
Delegate has the floor.
Thank you. I too have thoroughly enjoyed this debate because I am glad that we're talking about the commission. But one of the words that I was fighting for when it comes to a commission is independent. And we can go back and forth over how many Democrats or how many Republicans should be up there, but this is not independent redistricting, and that was what I was hoping for. I would like to also associate myself with some of the comments that my colleagues have made about representation, and though there has been some maybe suggestions about how we could make it better in the future, I really wish that we had something better before us. I even voted for something like this resolution last week because I was told there would be a good faith effort to get a better product out of conference, and we just did not get to the threshold of what I would call better, especially, Mr. Speaker, when there is just a mention of the Voting Rights Act, not the actual words. So if the Voting Rights Act is gutted, this mention would not offer the protections that the actual Voting Rights Act does. And also, Mr. Speaker, I have questions about when we're talking about racial minorities being able to choose the candidate of their choice. On line 27, Mr. Speaker, it says we're practicable. We're practicable. So this to me isn't about whether or not individual members of this body have black friends or do nice things for black people. This is about a resolution that we are about to pass to change our Commonwealth's Constitution. And I just don't think that racial fairness, language minority fairness, and cultural fairness should be parenthetical and optional. And so I am voting no.
Delegate from Spotsylvania, Delegate Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking to the resolution.
Delegate has the floor.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I must say I am surprised at what I'm hearing here on the floor today. I put this resolution in before session ever started. A lot of times I put in my legislation early to give people an opportunity to take a look at it and provide any feedback. This went through the process of P&E, where a couple of the members who spoke today serve on P&E. And I'll be honest with you, this is the first objections of these types that I have heard throughout this process. No member of the Black Caucus throughout session ever came to me with the concerns they're expressing today. If they had, I would have been happy to consider any additional language that they might have had in order to address or assuage their concerns. But I think what we do have before us, I think the resolution is fair. I think there will be minority participation in the process, and I hope that we will adopt the resolution.
Delegate from Fairfax, Delegate Sickles. Yeah.
Will the gentleman resume the floor for a series of questions?
Delegate from Norfolk, Delegate Lindsay. Will the Delegate Cole, Delegate Lindsay? Delegate
I will yield.
Question. Delegate yields.
I yield.
All right. The delegate would agree that people speak through their votes, would he not?
I would agree with that, but I don't know the reason behind the vote unless somebody speaks up.
Follow-up question?
Will the delegate yield for another question?
I yield.
And almost totally along party lines, your measure was voted against by persons on this side.
Mr. Speaker, I would agree with that. However, this conference report is far closer to the substitute that everybody on the other side of the aisle voted for than the original legislation.
Last question.
Delegate yield for another question.
And like you were never approached. I'm sorry.
Delegate yield for another question.
I yield.
Delegate yield.
All right. And so with all red lights coming up from the Democratic side of the committee and also the subcommittee, that didn't give you any pause that perhaps there was something that was objectionable about your measure?
Mr. Speaker, I will repeat my previous question. I knew that many members on the other side of the aisle objected to my original legislation. However, like I said before, this conference report is far closer to the substitute that was offered by the gentleman from Fairfax that the members across the aisle voted for.
Mr. Speaker, apologies. Just one final question.
With the delegate yield for another question.
I yield.
Delegate yield.
And lastly, even in the discussions before the votes, were not some of these very same arguments articulated by members on this side of the aisle?
Mr. Speaker, I would say they were not made to me.
Mr. Speaker, will the gentleman rise for an additional question?
The delegate yield for a question.
I yield.
Sir,
Delegate Yield.
the delegate helped me in my memory when a colleague of mine on privileges and elections offered a substitute to your resolution, and we were voting to PBI the substitute on your resolution. Did not 4 members from the Democratic Party raise some of the exact same objections that you are hearing, including myself?
Mr. Speaker, I will say that I do not recall any concerns raised about the makeup of the committee.
Delegate from Fairfax, Delegate Sickles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to speak to the resolution.
Delegate has the floor.
We can't, even if we want to, overturn federal law here. I've been here when we've tried to do that, but we can't overturn federal law. But despite that, in this compromise bill, if you go to line 23 and read through line 28, the new language says the district shall be drawn in accordance with the requirements of federal and state laws that address racial and ethnic fairness, including the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States and the provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 as amended, and judicial decisions interpreting such laws. Districts shall provide, where practicable, opportunities for racial and ethnic communities to elect candidates of their choice. Well, the Voting Rights Act has changed a lot over the years, as we all know. And right now, if you need to use race with a strict scrutiny criteria. The current law requires that every district, no matter what we do, meets a racial voting block analysis, whereas the minorities are still able to elect the candidate of their choice. That's the federal law. We can't change that. But we've still written it here anyway. Now, I can see, because this session is so short and things move so fast, that when this bill before us now, in many ways, not just like this, but a similar bill, came over here, it was as a Senate substitute on Delegate Cole's bill. And I asked you on my side of on the aisle, please accept the Senate substitute. And we had 49 votes to accept the substitute. That's this bill, but this bill now has a few more protections and has a transparency element it didn't have before. So maybe this bill isn't perfect. I haven't voted on a perfect bill yet. We're going to have a budget up in a few minutes that is not perfect from any person in here, but hopefully will be very good for the Commonwealth. Maybe because I have followed this, and the author of basically this bill is one of my 3 senators I share in my district, I've known about this idea, the 8 and the 8 and the 6 of the 8, for a long time now. And I'm sorry, I apologize to everybody if we didn't learn that over here. That's what was happening, and it passed the Senate 40-0. And one more point. I don't know how it would be good for a minority member, minority party member, not race, but anybody in this General Assembly, if you've been here a long time and legislatures work on a seniority basis, I could live with the bill that I offered as a floor amendment where politicians aren't involved at all. It doesn't matter to me. They could draw any district. I would run in it. However, there is a case to be made that why would you take somebody who's worked their way up the system, so they're going to be a chairman, they're going to be a ranking member, and have people not care about where they live, draw them out of the district? How does that help their people that they've been serving for so many years to be taken out of their district? They live in a house that maybe they inherited, or they've been in 35 years with their spouse. They don't want to move. They're not going to move. How does that help the people that we're trying to help on our side of the aisle? So this bill does have an element of practicality in it, where we can look out after the incumbents and make sure they can go back and represent their people as best as they can. So while it's not a perfect bill, I understand it. I think it's a great improvement over the status quo, and I would urge everyone to vote yes.
Delegate from Scott, Delegate Kilgore.
Mr. Speaker, I have a motion.
Delegate has the floor.
I move the pending question.
Delegate Kilgore moves the pending question. All those in favor of that motion will say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. The pending question is moved. Shall the conference report be adopted? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 83, noes 15.
Ayes 83, noes 15. The conference report is adopted.